The 16th century in France is mostly remembered for the civil wars that racked the country from 1562 to 1629. These wars, often collectively known as the Wars of Religion, were ostensibly fought between the forces of the Catholic majority, often, but not always, in the name of the king, and the new Reformed Protestant minority, mostly Calvinists. These wars have sometimes been framed as an interruption to the natural state-making of France into the absolutist monarchy that fell during the 1789 French Revolution. The series of episodes draws instead on the historiographical trends that have emerged since the 1960s, which do not view the absolutism of the 1700s as inevitable in 1500. For sure, during the long French 16th century and the Wars of Religion, as we're framing this, there were events and currents that prefigured absolutist rule, and even some that look eerily like the stirrings of republicanism and laïcité, or secularism. But what also emerges is a picture of absolutism developing as a response to the problems of these civil wars, and not as something interrupted in its course by them. The thing about the French Wars of Religion is that they were both French and about religion, but equally, they grew out of entanglements and developments between France and its neighbors and gave outlet to any number of various political, social, and regional tensions that had built up around Ancien Regime France, both before and during the process of nation-state making of the early modern era. Religious zeal, opposition, and conflict were real, and yet, as Judith Pullman demonstrated in the case of the 16th century Netherlands, and as Stuart Carroll applied to 1560s France, it takes more than the existence of religious division for people to start lynching each other. This is likewise the case of social and political divisions. Quote, both religious division and social antagonism require instrumentalizing, unquote. The French Wars of Religion were a particularly complicated web of antagonism and instrumentalization. Mac P. Holt, in the opening of his book on the wars, says the following, quote, like Michel de Montaigne, perhaps I too ought to have called this book an essay in the original sense, for an attempt is about all one can manage in the face of the confusing morass of court factions, countless leading actors and bit players, a seemingly unending series of peace agreements followed by renewed warfare, and the bizarre diplomatic intrigues of nearly every state in Western Europe that made up the French Wars of Religion.
I have to say, Mac P. Holt, that could either be a 1920s detective or a historian, but either way, it's probably the coolest author name we've ever used on the show.
Yeah, he's like Mac. That is a very cool name. Mac P. Holt also sounds like he's the guy who gave Frank Sinatra his first recording contract.
Exactly.
And he also went to prison for just murdering a dude.
He's a guy who said "yeah" a lot.
Yeah. Listen, you see. These folks don't want to hear none of that nonsense, you see.
We want that new jazz. They want those blue-eyed white boys up on stage clicking their fingers, singing about swinging hips and killing people.
That man's pants are pulled solidly up to his nipples.
Hey, listen, it's cold at that time. They hadn't really adopted the t-shirt at this time, so you got to keep your nips warm somehow. And what is better to keep your nips warm than,
gotta tuck them in.
Wool pants that come up to your armpits.
There was an anecdote that apparently David Bowie was in New York in the early 70s and was in talks about potentially playing Frank Sinatra in a biopic. And he tried to meet Frank Sinatra, and Sinatra instead sent out, one of his heavies, some guy who's probably named like Guido Di Facoli, who was like, hey, yo, Frank don't want to meet you and he don't want no limey homo playing him neither. And so when I think about that guy, his paycheck was also signed by someone who could be named Mac P. Holt, not the actual Mac P. Holt.
Yeah, if Bowie would have instead been pitched to play like Charles Aznavour would have been like, hell yeah, I'm down with this.
I mean, Bowie was a good actor. In what he played, like was actually quite good and quite a lot. I mean, he famously did the Elephant Man on stage, but what's it called?
Labyrinth.
Yeah, there's Labyrinth. But no, he played Andy Warhol in the Basquiat, and he was really funny. I mean, genuinely. But that's not really the point of today. The point of today is let's talk about the French Wars of Religion. And I guess this was a complicated series of conflicts that shaped much of the evolution of early modern France. Putting the Bourbons on the throne was one of its more striking outcomes. Yet this also means it has complicated foundations and causal factors. We need to set some definitions from the outset in order to understand these properly. European nation-states as we understand them were beginning to form and coalesce during the 16th century, but taking their features for granted as resembling the way our world works in the 21st century and the way we view and conceptualize our states, our beliefs, and the relations of ourselves and others to them is like taking for granted that the features of a baby will resemble their features at age 70. Sure, the majority of the shapes are there, and we can probably agree that it's still the same person, but there's a lot of growth and change to occur in the intervening period that transforms how that body works and relates to the world, as well as how it functions and relates to and understands itself. A lot of that change and development is lumpy. Puberty might bring rapid metamorphosis, but so equally can sudden stress or injury before the steady transformation of adult life and old age sets in. The extended body metaphor is deliberately chosen. 16th century contemporaries liked to imagine their societies and emerging nations as a body. France was no different. At the head of its body social was the king, forming the royal skeleton for the French nation. Though post-revolutionary France has come to be associated with laïcité, or secularism, the separation of church and state, not only was none of this inevitable in the 1500s, it was anathema to the way the French understood themselves. The, quote, most Christian kings, unquote, traced a lineage of their interwovenness with the will of God on earth back to Charlemagne. Their kings were still traditionally crowned at the Cathedral of Rheims, like Charlemagne was by the Pope in the year 800. French coronations were an explicitly religious and Catholic affair, far beyond the standard of comparable kingdoms. In 16th century England, coronation practices were considered, in the words of Thomas Cranmer, to be, quote, but a ceremony, unquote, not something to be taken seriously or literally. By contrast, the Catholic Church was explicitly tied into the body of the French king. The anointing of their bodies with the holy oil was a form of physical connection to God, making the French kings an extension of the divine, as Jean Gaulin commented on this in the 14th century. When the king removes his clothing for the consecration, quote, that signifies that he relinquishes his previous worldly estate in order to assume that of the royal religion, unquote.
Yeah, they got to get lathered up to rule.
We have to do essential oils to become king.
And the descendants of the holy lineage of Charlemagne must also take on the mantle of continuing the forever war with the kingdom of sway in the morning.
Yeah, I was gonna say that like they have to take on the mantle of the god.
I kind of like the idea that you can trace the lineage of French coronation ceremonies to like evil hippie wellness influencers now. It's like, and in that regard, those dudes who tried to create like a breakaway state in the Sonora Desert, the Spanish guys in the 1850s, will be so happy that Tulum exists now, because it's basically like, it's like, look, they're basically doing French coronation things and telling people like, you don't have to take medicine. You can just huff lavender oil and you'll be okay.
I'm really happy that I finally have something in common with French kings, and that is, on a long enough timeline, they too also got way too involved with a white girl with dreads named Sage once.
The king's pledges during the coronation included formulations such as, I promise in the name of Christ, first, that by our authority, the whole Christian populace will preserve at all times true peace for the Church of God. I shall be diligent to expel from my land all heretics designated by the Church. It is not difficult to understand how we go from here to the later absolutist Bourbon kings being like gods in their own right, given the explicitness of the divine connection that had been built up in the person of the French monarch. If the king was the head of the French body social, then the Catholic Church was his lifeblood. And, by extension, with the nation state itself coalescing around the most Christian king as head of the political and religious state, the boundaries between royal service and service to the church were invisible. Both amounted to the same thing. Likewise, to pose a threat to the religion also by extension meant posing a threat to the political order, and from there the integrity of the body social. Another important 16th century definition to pin down before diving further into events is that of religion itself. Religion in its more contemporary sense formed the primary fulcrum of the conflict. That is to say, religion as a body of believers rather than the more 21st century conceptualization of a religion as a body of beliefs. It's a slightly strange difference to get your head around, but belonging consciously to the Catholic flock made you a Catholic, and defending Catholicism was defending the integrity and purity of that flock. Protestants were beginning to experiment with ideas of how it is the nature of practices and beliefs themselves that make a religion. But the key concept here for our 16th century actors is still one of being part of and having a place in the community or body of your co-religionists, rather than being explicitly defined by and attached to exactly what it is you believe. This is important in understanding the coming bits about how scholars or preachers could be revivalists and spiritual reformers with what are obviously quite heterodox beliefs without necessarily being seen as heretics or having left the Catholic Church. And also how those who openly left the church could be so easily seen as poisonous and cancerous to the overall body social of France.
It reminds me a lot of like when we talked about the Anabaptist rebellion, where the whole thing that they went into was like, these people say that they're men and people of God, but they don't prove it by doing anything they say. Like, you need to prove that you're a believer by actually doing the things from the Bible, and also like what we say, because this is rapidly going to go out of control.